Hello, my name is Imad Mouin. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for CompuWare Application Performance Management. And today we're going to be talking about why load testing from just the cloud doesn't really work, certainly not for real-world web applications. Let's talk about your web applications and how they're built. So typically, you're probably using a stack a little bit like this. Some load balancers, some web servers, an app server that may or may not be co-located. You may have some databases. You may have maybe a host system with an AI layer. So it's certainly more than reasonable to think of this as your main infrastructure, and this is what you need to test. However, for a web application, there's more to it than just this stack. The content has to get to your end users somewhere over here. And between your stack sitting in your data center or your colo space and the end users, there's an entire application delivery chain. And every component in this chain has an impact on the successful completion rate of your applications or your transactions, as well as the end user experience. So how does that figure in your overall testing? There is, of course, the ISP that your data center is connected to. There are the third-party services that send content straight to the end user's desktops. There's maybe content delivery networks that help you accelerate your application and deliver it faster. There are local ISPs and, of course, a myriad of browsers and devices that have quite a bit of impact to that overall experience. So let's talk about that for just a second. Your typical application looks a little bit more like this. Your website, for example, yes, will bring in content from behind your firewall. You may have session information, a search service, content management server. You may have, of course, content delivered straight from within your database through your application server and some business logic that you may have written yourself. But increasingly, you might have content coming in from third-party providers. It might be your content being delivered on your behalf by a content delivery network. You might have a web analytics tag. You may have ads from an ad server. You may have video, ratings and reviews, a shopping cart. None of that comes through that architecture or that stack that we described before. It's all coming in and being aggregated, assembled at the browser itself. Not only that, but the browser is doing more work than ever before. Typically, this is not some dumb assembly and rendering of that content. In more cases than not, the browser is actually performing real work. You're sending it code, typically JavaScript, for example. More and more applications are Ajax heavy. So now you're relying on the browser to deliver a big part, a big chunk of that overall experience. What's key here is that now you start thinking about your application as being what the end user sees, not the code that you wrote somewhere over here. And this is what needs to work and work well. So when it comes to load testing, it is imperative that you load test from the end user's perspective. It is imperative that what you're looking for is whether the application is working for the end users. So let's go back to this application delivery chain. If you're using traditional load testing or load testing 1.0, so typically you'll have some software and hardware somewhere inside your firewall putting a bunch of stress onto the components of your applications that live behind your firewall. Typically what you'll be measuring are things like the memory utilization, the CPU utilization, maybe even the I/O to try to figure out whether you're meeting certain thresholds or not. Now, what does that tell you about whether your application is actually going to work or not? Very, very little. What is that going to tell you about the end user experience? Almost nothing. Now, some of you have already figured that out and have started saying, well, you know what if I move this over here? Same kind of software, but in this case, I'll run it from a few data centers or maybe even one of those cloud providers, which of course still run within data centers. Maybe I'll get a better view into what's going on. I'll be able to exercise the network and so on and so forth. Well, you'll get better visibility, but that's not all. You certainly will not have any insight into what the response time will be, whether it's for a page or an entire workflow. Because of course, your users are sitting here. Your users aren't sitting in a data center. You have no idea whether your success rate under load is going to be representative of what will happen in the real world. Simply because you're running that load test from a data center or multiple data centers. If you have a CDN, well, forget about it in that particular case, because exercising a CDN from a data center has very little to do from a performance perspective when compared to running a CDN or exercising it from an end user's perspective. So the only way to truly understand what your end user's experience is really going to be is to run your load testing from over here. And this way you're exercising your entire application delivering chain and understanding specifically what the load and response time is going to be under load. So ultimately, what is it that you want to really be able to track? Very simple. Let's talk about 3 different metrics. As a function of load, you want to know, for example, what is the response time going to be? So whether you measure load in virtual users or page views, you want to know what is the response time, which is a good indicator of end user experience, going to be or look like as a function of that load. And you might want to have a certain threshold above which the experience is no longer good, right? The breaking point of the experience as opposed to the breaking point of the infrastructure. So what is it going to look like? At what point does it break? You also want to know, for example, what is the success rate going to look like for your most important transactions or workflows as a function of the load? At what point does it start breaking down? Of course, you want it to be as close to 100% as possible. And if it starts breaking down, then you know that it's no longer tolerable. And of course, you want to know about the quality of the deliverable. Are you sending good content? Or are you all of a sudden starting to send pages that may not be complete, that may have errors in them, broken images, and so on and so forth? So what's that level of quality? How many object level errors all the way to consumption point are you seeing? Again, that's a key metric. Hopefully that'll be 0. And at some point in time, as load increases, it might start increasing. So you have to decide at what point does the end user experience start breaking down as a function of the load. And that is the key thing that you want to measure, and the only way to measure it is from that end user experience.